Hello, welcome to the Japan Night Porter YouTube channel. I hope you're all enjoying the new Richard Barbieri album Hauntings. It came out yesterday in the UK and it's available on all download and streaming sites, just a sample EP on Spotify, but apart from that it should be available worldwide, if not today, in the next few days. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about something completely different, and it's about the connection between the bands Japan and Yellow Magic Orchestra, or shortened to YMO, as I'll probably refer to them in most of this video. So this is something that's been covered on the internet before, but I don't think in very much depth. So in this video I'm going to be talking about some of the circumstances that led to them working together and the reasons why. It's pretty interesting. So out of both bands, Japan started first, 1974. I've talked about this a lot. And by 1979, they'd become pretty famous in the country of Japan and had certainly gained the attention of various musicians that were surrounding the wider YMO circle. For example, Keiichi Suzuki from Moonriders, who frequently worked with members of YMO, he wrote a piece in one of the Japan tour programs. So, anyway, there's somebody at my front door.
Before you get into personal stereo, first see Sanyo. Sanyo make personal stereo from around 30 pounds. Machines with your kind of sound. Some with radio, and even some with speakers. Those with a wide head for value see Sanyo, then decide.
Yeah, so Yellow Magic Orchestra was formed in 1978 by Haru Hosono, Yukihiro Takahashi and Ryuichi Sakamoto. Each had been active in music for several years before that, and it's notable that all of them were older than the members of Japan. Hosono around about a decade older, Sakamoto and Takahashi maybe 5 or 6 years older. So they're coming from a different level of maturity and experience within the music business than Japan were. Japan in 1978-79 was still very young, only just out of their teens, and yeah, they still had a lot to learn. So I believe that YMO first became aware of Japan rather than the other way around, and that was just because Japan were very big in the Japanese music press, and they were played on the radio and on TV from sort of late 78 onwards, when their first 2 albums were released in the country and proved to be quite big sellers. At that point, YMO hadn't broken through. They just released their first album, and it hadn't really sold that well, but it did get picked up by the record company A&M for release in America. However, A&M wanted to remix it first. So at the same time that Japan were doing their first tour of Japan, Hosono was over in Hollywood getting the first YMO album remixed for its worldwide release. Meanwhile, Takahashi and Sakamoto were touring with Akiko Yano, who at that point had already broken through as a star and was playing major venues in Japan. So yeah, they weren't famous before Japan were, kind of. Takahashi had previously been in the Sadistic Mica Band from the early to mid 70s. They'd obviously toured the UK with Roxy Music, and Steve Jansen's on record saying that he saw them play live, as I believe all the members of Japan did, because they were into Roxy, so they went to at least one show on that tour, the Siren Tour. So anyway, how did Japan become aware of YMO then? Well, the interesting thing is that Japanese Japan fans started to send mixtapes over to members of the band, definitely to Mick, because Mick's on record as saying that he received some of these, and they included tracks by YMO members, but interestingly enough, Akiko Yano, because they thought that the members of Japan might enjoy the music. It turned out they did, or at least I know that Mick did, because he said so. So that was going on in the background, and it was just before Japan actually toured Japan the country. And it was while they were in Japan that their record company, Victor in Japan, also a record company for YMO, who were distributing Alpha Records, which was the independent label that YMO was signed to. So there was a business connection there, and there was an interest in Victor label acts, if you like, collaborating to promote each other. It was quite maturely done in Japan. They tried to get the Alexander's Ragtime Band, or ARB for short, promoted through supporting Japan, but that didn't really take off despite 2 attempts to do so on the tours in 79 and 80. Japan were much more interested in working with electronic or more experimental musicians as time went on. So yeah, Japan in 79, they started to build an electronic sounds into their show with the arrival of European Sun in the set, very sequencer led, and then immediately after the Japanese tour they went off to work with Giorgio Moroder in LA. Now Moroder's music for The Chase from the film Midnight Express was also a massive influence on YMO at the time, so you had a sort of connection there through Giorgio Moroder, but the members of YMO never works with Moroder. But then why would they? Because they've already got the skills to do everything that Moroder and his studio team did anyway. So then next thing that happened was Life in Tokyo got released. It was a hit in Japan, and it became known then. Sandy from Sandy and the Sunsets, for example, said she became aware of Japan through Life in Tokyo, and it was part of that. They were really clever, I think, to release it at that time, because just when YMO released Life in Tokyo in Japan, which was summer 79, the electronic technopop boom sort of exploded. So all of a sudden, with the release of the Technopolis single and the Solid State Survivor album, YMO became massively big in Japan. It's funny because it didn't take off with the first album, it did with the second one. Reason for that was that YMO did some dates in Los Angeles with the Tubes. Those were filmed and the news was broadcast in the US and Japan. So it became a news story that a Japanese act had performed in LA successfully and were being shown on the American media. So it's kind of like a story of a story. Victor Records, of course, loved this. They were very, very happy with it. All of a sudden, YMO came to national attention, especially with young kids, and who thought that anything outside Japan was interesting, which is a counterpoint to people in the UK thinking that anything Japanese was cool or interesting at that time. So I think it was a grass is greener thing going on. So anyway, yeah, so Japan and YMO both successful, sort of mid to late 79. And then Victor kind of thinking, well, what can we do here? What can we do to maybe bring these two acts together to see if anything's possible? So one of the things they did was they actually helped Simon Nepiabel, Japan's manager, get in touch with YMO's managers just to see if anything could happen. The first thing that was proposed was that a joint interview happened between David Sylvian and Ryuichi Sakamoto, who was the member of YMO that was most interested in potentially working with different acts. Now, a bit of context to this, Sakamoto was fiercely independent at that time in his life. He didn't want to sign to any record deal with anyone, and he was quite stubborn in that respect. It led to some arguments between him and Hosono, but Sakamoto was in a different position to Hosono and Takahashi. He was the one member of the band who hadn't had his own success under his own name by that point. He was very much a session musician, member of a couple of different bands, backing bands, I mean, for an act called Lily. Also crossed paths with Masami Tsuchiya, interestingly enough. And he backed up Taika Oniki, Akiko Yano, of course, and Takahashi and Hosono both in live work and in their solo recordings, but he wasn't yet a star. He became a star with YMO. And he said that at that time, just before Solid State Survivor was released, he reached a bit of a crisis point. He was also working as an academic, and he wasn't sure whether he was going to continue on that path or whether he was in effect going to become a pop star, as he put it. So he thought that through seriously, and in the end, the success of Solid State Survivor helped him make his decision, and he became, you know, a full-time musician, recording artist, but he did still have status as an associate professor and occasionally attended lectures at the university in Tokyo. So that was the other turning point that happened to him in 1979 was that he met and fell in love with Akiko Yano at that time. Both of them had been in prior relationships, and both of them had had children in their prior relationships, but they got together as a result of having worked together over a couple of years, and then they became a couple and eventually married in 1982. Took some time about it, but yeah, they got together as a couple in 1979 after they were both separated or divorced, at least, from their previous partners. So yeah, he was going through a lot of changes in his life, and he didn't want to be tied down musically. He'd seen how acts had been you know, coerced into doing things they didn't necessarily want to do if they were signed to a label. So he very much went down the independent path. He got assistance from an old university friend of his, Akira Akuta, to help manage things, but really he was kind of like self-managed from that point on. Akiko had her own manager, who she's still with now, and you know, that's the way they wanted to work it. Whereas for Sono and Takahashi, you know, they had management teams. They were fully signed up to Alpha Records through Victor, and that was the way they preferred it. They were used to being major label artists by that point, with all of the support available. But that was not for Sakamoto. He wanted to remain independent. He wanted to work on whatever he wanted to do without any pressure. So, for example, he produced an album by a Japanese punk band called Friction. He worked with an alternative singer called Few. He also backed up a couple of singers and artists that were not necessarily going to be successful or popular, but he just wanted to do projects that he was genuinely interested in. So that was his mindset. Kind of sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? If you know the history of David Sylvian in particular. So, but yeah, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. So yeah, Victor and Hansa Records and Alpha Records were quite keen for something to happen between Japan and YMO, because they were coming from two different directions, but were both successful for the labels. So they proposed that David and Ryuichi interview each other for Music Life magazine. And this eventually took place in March 1980, while Japan were in Japan for the Quiet Life tour. And this is the first time that Ryuichi and David had met. And it's fair to say they hit it off really well. They were talking about the positives and negatives of each other's cultures, why they enjoyed recording. They didn't particularly at that time talk about each other's work, although by that point David had heard YMO. Ryuichi hadn't done much solo work up to that point, but he'd heard of Japan, of course, because of the recommendations, and they were both really positive. But the first meeting was quite shy. However, they got on really well, and their managers also got on really well, so they kept in touch with each other. And by this point, Ryuichi knew that he was going to be going to London to do some recording a couple of months later. So they sort of had tentative plans to potentially see each other and maybe work on something. So the plan was that Ryuichi was meant to go to London to do some initial bit of a recce for his Beta Unit album, and then plan some recording, and he was just going to basically organise everything himself. He didn't want much input from anybody. He'd arranged for some English translations to be done through a friend of a friend who was Peter Barbieri. So that's where he entered the YMO sphere, and that was something that Ryuichi was quite keen on, because he wanted to work with someone who would translate his intentions and his words very well into English, rather than working with the former lyricist, who was Chris Mosdell, who was an artist in his own right and was basically creating poems to set to music for YMO. And they were very verbose, very British, very humorous. But that's not the direction that Ryuichi wanted to take. He wanted to express how he felt from the inside, which is how Thatness and Dareness came out. It was originally written by Ryuichi in Japanese, and he collaborated with Peter Barbieri to come out with the words. And that came out on Beta Unit, and it's a pivotal track for Ryuichi. And it's something that resonated with Sylvian as well. So anyway, Sakamoto was in London sort of very late spring, early summer of 1980, which is when Japan were working on gentleman tape Polaroids. Now, Ryuichi was supposed to leave London and actually go to France to work on a Kazuhiko Kato album, but he had a bit of a period of depression, and he got physically ill, so he declined going out to France, and instead opted to stay in London for a few more weeks. Interestingly enough, Akiko Yano then took Ryuichi's place, and they later met up together. After that, she'd just recently returned from maternity leave, having had Miu in the May, and it's fair to say that it's fairly unconventional, but you know, Ryuichi, you know, kind of had already planned to go to London, so yeah, he did so. And Akiko had a nanny to help with Miu when she was very young. But anyway, that's besides the point. They were both doing the recordings, and eventually Ryuichi did get over to Paris to finish off the recording of that Kazuhiko Kato album. So there you go. There you have it. Ryuichi was not in the best frame of mind, but he was very much open for collaborating. So he reconnected with David and went into work on Polaroids, and came up with Taking Islands in Africa on the spot, which, if you know the album Beta Unit, you can recognise some of the programming similarities between tracks like Riot and Lagos and Thatness and Dareness and what went into Taking Islands in Africa. There's something about the tone of the bass synth in particular, and some of the electronic percussion which would have fitted in on Beta Unit, or Tin Drum for that matter. I think Taking Islands in Africa is very much like the precursor to what was going on with Tin Drum in some ways. But anyway, that collaboration was very short, very swift. It was mostly done in one day, and then Ryuichi was off to finish Beta Unit, and then he had to go to Paris. So they had a sort of a fleeting meeting, but they did socialise a bit more then, and it helped Ryuichi to feel a bit better to work with the guys from Japan. It was his, his self-determination to be independent, which actually led to him working with Japan, because it could have been a problem. As it happened, they were both signed to Victor in Japan, so things were smoothed over in terms of management, publishing and all of the rest. But then again, Japan and Ryuichi wanted that track to happen. It's kind of an outlier on Gentleman Tape Polaroids, but it does fit in with the overall LP itself. So we're talking now about sort of July, August 1980. Japan had signed with Virgin Records. They'd kept the link with Victor in Japan, so that was all fine. And YMO had another #1 album out by then. They'd had a live album out from the 1979 tour. Akiko was about to release a solo album, and Beta Unit also came out very late summer 1980 in Japan. So you had a lot of things coalescing all at the same time. Then from October through to December 1980, YMO had a world tour. Unlike their prior tour, it was different lineup. They had Kenji Omura on guitar, but apart from that, same lineup. Akiko and Ryuichi both in the band, so they could spend proper time together on tour, and it went really well. They had some time socialising with the New Romantic crowd in London, and that's something I talked about on a prior video as well. They were definitely developing strong friendships with Japan by this point, and it's something that carried on for the next couple of years in a big way. So in a sense, Ryuichi's depression led to the collaboration with Japan, and it's fair to say, I mean, everyone knows it, and Akiko confirmed it, that David and Ryuichi became really close friends, and they plan to do more collaborative work together. This is where it gets a bit interesting. So early 1981, Japan were in Japan again, and they did a second interview for Music Life between David and Ryuichi. By this time, they knew each other really well, and it comes across in the interview, which was actually published in Japan's Japanese tour program from early 81. They're talking about the Jet Tape Polaroids album, that YMO really liked it, and David was lucky enough to hear an early version of the BGM album as well, which obviously he liked. I mean, BGM and Polaroids, I think, have a bit of a relationship. There's certainly some similar synth program going on with the Prophet 5, and it saw YMO go in a much more serious direction, to the detriment of their sales, actually, to some degree, but they were still selling a lot of albums. But they had a hit single with Q, but then a few months later they released Mass as a single, and that didn't chart, which was a bit of a shock to the YMO gang. But there you go, they were deliberately experimental. Now, what was behind that, again, was Ryuichi's wish to be independent. He had a bit of a conflict with Hosono at the time BGM was recorded. They spent a lot of time on tour, and his interests were very much veering towards the experimental music side. He wasn't wanting to go down the pop route anymore, and that kind of pushed YMO to be much more experimental and inventive, which in retrospect is a good thing, but their personal relationships were in a bad way at that time. At least they were between Sakamoto and Hosono, both of whom have spoken about it. And I think there was a bit of a tussle to see who was going to be in charge of the direction of the band. Ultimately, Hosono had started the group, and he'd invited the other two to join, so it was his band. But in terms of personal fame and success, Ryuichi was starting to overshadow him. Ryuichi, because of his independence and his unwillingness to sign to any kind of formal deal, meant he could do all the commercials he wanted, all the sessions he wanted, and he was a very, very busy man at that time. He didn't turn anything down that he was interested in doing. So he released a couple of singles with other people outside the YMO group, and this is something that he was trying to sell David on. David was talking about feeling a bit trapped after the recording of Polaroids, about how he'd taken control to get it all finished off, and it had ended up being quite a tense situation within the band Japan at the end of Jet Tape Polaroids. Ultimately, Rob Dean left the group the following spring. Although that was by mutual agreement, everything that led up to that obviously will have had a detrimental effect. So what Ryuichi was trying to sell to David was that, you know, take the opportunity to be independent for yourself, maybe record a solo album, do something else, get that out of your system, and then you can potentially come back to the band renewed, which is actually what had just happened with him and Hosono. They managed to patch things up after BGM and after Ryuichi had gone away and done a couple of pieces of work independently, produced another Akiko Yano album, that kind of thing. And they kind of got their mojo back as a threesome in time to start working on the Technodelic album. in the summer of 81. So that was all very nice for them, but you could see that from the published interviews, you can tell that it probably left David thinking about a lot of things, and you know, what would it mean if I went solo? Ultimately, David decided to be true to the band and basically made a decision in discussion with them that they wouldn't do solo work while the band was still active, that they would try to put their best forward for the band. And that's something he said in numerous interviews in the past, and he did at the time, that was his belief. He kind of wanted to do some solo work in the future, but he was thinking that everybody should focus on Japan and make that the main thing. And that was what led to some tension, you know, a few months down the line while they were recording Tin Drum, because Mick wanted to start doing some solo work, and he'd obviously started to have all of his outside interests. And that's something Richard talks about in interviews recently, especially on the Rock on Tours. So kind of David had this influence from outside. He was also getting to know the journalist Paul Morley by this point. And Paul, in all innocence, had suggested as well that he could maybe do something solo, get things out of his system, at the same time keep Japan going. I don't think that Ryuichi or Paul had any intention of being a catalyst to Japan splitting up or giving David these thoughts. It's just what happened ultimately. So yeah, it's interesting one, this, that there was that influence put on David, and it had sort of unexpected consequences a couple of years down the line. So yeah, so you're at 81, Rob's left Japan, and they're starting to be on an upward trajectory when it comes to their success in the UK and in some parts of Europe. They're starting to sell more records, become more popular, more people turning up to the live shows and buying tickets, starting to buy merchandise. It was all going very well. It was kind of approaching the level that it was in Japan, and it had done they got there by the end of 81. Similar success level, I would say. But then again, that started to put more pressure on the members of Japan, and David in particular. He didn't like touring, whereas the others did. And there were lots of proposals put forward for quite lucrative shows, and he was turning them down. And that caused a bit of friction in the band, although they were all very supportive of each other at this point. Meanwhile, YMO, back on track. They got the Technodelic album done and out, and then they did a big tour of Japan. It was probably their biggest tour up to that point, where they played the hell out of the BGM and Technodelic albums, basically. And it's kind of a stunning show, which luckily they did film in full and released a year later as Winter Live. Yeah, stunning stage set, really innovative, and yeah, something that had not been done before, such as performing behind a screen for about 4 numbers and letting the shapes and the lights of the really architectural design of that Winter Live set kind of do the work. They're kind of going in a direction a bit like Kraftwerk did, I suppose, although Kraftwerk did it much more with video and 3D, whereas YMO used actual stage sets, and they were hiding away the traditional accoutrements of rock music behind you know, like, well, I don't know what you'd call it, I suppose, little staging posts, little sort of like, not barriers and things. So you couldn't see the keyboard, you could barely see the drums. You just saw their 3 heads poking up from behind this sort of podium things, and then them using fixed microphones, as well as headset microphones. So yeah, it's quite funny. And then Sakamoto at the end of the show would come out and do a bit of a dance routine with a group of kids to the song Taiso, which means exercises. So yeah, they're definitely doing things differently. You can only imagine the members of Japan looking on, thinking, that's interesting, that sounds really good. David in particular was probably quite fascinated by it, although they were both on tour at the same time, so they won't have seen each other's shows for a little while, probably until the following spring. And of course, the following spring, as you know, this is early 82, this is when the work between Japan and YMO members really came to its fruition. So you had Mick, Steve, Bill Nelson, and also Percy Jones separately, all working with Masami Tsuchiya, Ryuichi Sakamoto was on one track on Rice Music as well. So you had a slight crossover there. And then immediately afterwards, they started working with Akiko Yano on her album, Aiga Nakacho ni. And that, of course, was co-produced with Ryuichi. Richard wasn't involved in either project, but he did attend the studio just on a social basis, as we've got photographs of that. But, you know, Richard's not a backing singer, so he wasn't going to do anything like that. And they had some of the best keyboard players in the world in Ryuichi and Akiko, so, you know, he wasn't needed for that project. Meanwhile, though, he went off to work in Sweden with Lustans Lackager, so that's a whole other thing that he got into. And of course, then David and Ryuichi started working on the Bamboo Music and Bamboo Houses single. Interesting, there's a few different versions of it out. It came out that summer. So this is the original UK gatefold. You had Ryuichi on the front, David on the back, but then you got the non-gatefold, which is actually harder to find, which has got David on the front, same as the 12-inch single, and Ryuichi on the back with the credits. So yeah, it was quite a breakthrough single for both of them, really, although I have to say it sounds a lot like Tin Drum. So I think you can see who had the greater influence over who on that particular song, those songs rather. But they're both fantastic. They are, I think, very, very innovative. They had hip hop drums, I think, to some extent. And of course, Steve was on both tracks as well. I think in some ways it's kind of like a trio kind of project. So YMO took some considerable time off in 1982, by the way. Hosono and Takahashi set up the Yen label. They signed Sandy and the Sunsets to that. And then David and Yuka had actually gone over to Japan after finishing Bamboo Houses, Bamboo Music, for the launch of Yen, which there was a special concert held. And then Steve went over too to be part of Takahashi's band. David had a couple of other things to do during that summer, principally promoting Japan in America, but then he was back to Japan again for late summer, early autumn, to spend time with Steve on tour with Takahashi. And you had Sakamoto, Akiko, the whole gang were involved, and Masami Tsuchiya was playing guitar on that tour as well. And Masami was chosen for the last Japan tour partly because he got on with everybody. So he'd invited Mick Karn to be involved in his Rice Music album several months earlier, so they liked each other, got on great. They remained friends for the rest of their lives, worked together numerous times. And of course, Steve got on with Masami really well, and David liked him as well. Liked his appearance, sense of style, the whole lot. And, you know, David was interested in having a guitarist that was going to be a bit more abstract for the Sons of Pioneers tour. So Masami suited them right down to the ground. Having said that, Masami can play anything in any style. I think it's a bit of a mistake to assume that what you hear on All On Canvas is typical of him. It's really not. Masami's got a wide range of styles to draw upon. Very, very skilled guitarist indeed. Anyway, so you've got Japan and YMO, firm friends by this point. All sorts of crossovers happening. On the final Japan tour in Japan, you have YMO members guesting at their big show at the Budokan. It was actually broadcast on Sakamoto's radio show. And then just a couple of weeks later, after the final Japan concert, Steve and David attended Sound Street along with Peter Barakan for an hour-long, extremely drunk radio show where they basically spent ages complimenting each other, making jokes, playing a couple of Japan songs and a couple of other bits of music that they liked. And you could hear kind of a sense of relief in everyone's voices that Japan had parted, and they had a sense of freedom. Steve liked it so much that he stayed on longer in Japan after that, and he should have gone home a bit earlier, but he didn't. So then, right at the end of that trip, Ryuichi had finished filming Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and so started to plan the soundtrack. And of course, the vocal version of the soundtrack is sung by David Sylvian. It was recorded around about February 1983. The back of the Japanese single This is the version which has not got a picture of Bowie on it. That's a whole other thing. It says that the lyric was written on 16th of February 1983. Single eventually came out in sort of April in Japan, and then a couple of months later in the UK. Obviously UK, different packaging here, and it was obviously a big success everywhere. Now, a couple of things. First thing is that when the Japanese single originally came out, it had a little picture of David Bowie on the back cover. Now, David wasn't too happy about that. He wanted to avoid confusion with Bowie, people thinking that Bowie might have sung the theme, and it was just like, it was not on. So they actually got that removed, and that's why I've got that copy that's just not got a picture of David Bowie on it, but I'll have shown a picture by now. Now in France, there was a different problem cropped up. So in France, they decided to release the single with the name of the French title of the film on the front. Clearly says David Sylvian Ryuichi Sakamoto, but obviously you've got a certain Mr. Bowie appearing on the front cover, and you've just got David on the back there, which was a bit unfortunate. So yeah, they had to change the cover in France as well, and eventually they went with the familiar Sylvian Sakamoto sleeve with a plain back. It's actually got Merry Christmas Mr. Lawrence on the B-side, or let's call it Forbidden Colours instrumental here. Yeah, same single inside, but two different sleeves for that reason. So it was twice with that release that David had to complain that they were doing the wrong thing over in different countries. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I'm going to stop there because I could literally go on for decades about how Japan and YMO got together. But I just hope that's given a bit more understanding of the kind of circumstances around it, and how some of the frustrations that Sakamoto and Sylvian were both feeling in their own individual lives sort of came together and led them to have the friendship and to be very supportive of each other doing new work. David certainly had a strong connection with the B2 Unit album, and that's borne out. I think that's a big influence on the sound of Tin Drum the following year, and I know that all the members of Japan enjoyed that album. And you know, it's a testament to Ryuichi's creativity that he was able to engage David in that way, because it never happened with any other musician I know of, at least not during the Japan years. He hit it off later on with Pia Baru, and even later still with Holter when he came to make Brilliant Trees. But yeah, that connection with a wider group of musicians probably inspired Japan very much as they started to think about going solo. And it's certainly for, so say, Steve, Mick and David in particular, it led to them having a lot of work in Japan, the country. David had other Richard had other connections, however, because he'd worked with different bands in Sweden, Germany and other places in Europe. And throughout the 80s, he continued to do that, producing acts such as Con Act. Richard also produced the first solo album by Akira Mitake in early 1983. And then both him and Steve went on tour with Ippu-do. So that relationship continued. And again, in turn, that led to Worlds in a Small Room. So I needn't go on much further from there. Worlds in a Small Room is something I'd like to talk about on its own a bit later on. So I hope that was interesting. I hope that was useful to kind of get a bit of background understanding on why Japan and YMO did start to work together, and then the implications of that, because I think it had an impact on both groups, very much so. It improved Sakamoto's mood, which meant that he went back to work to Technodelic with Hosono in a much greater spirit of congeniality, which helped to resolve their problems. And from David's point of view, it must have got the old cogs whirring about what might be possible in terms of a future solo career. So anyway, until next time, everyone take care. Hope to see some of you in Liverpool later this week for Richard's show there. Please do say hello if you see me. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy the videos. It really does help me out, and I will see you again soon.
Before you get into personal stereo, first see Sanyo. Sanyo make personal stereo from around 30 pounds. Machines with your kind of sound. Some with radio and even some with speakers. Those with a wise head for value see Sanyo, then decide.